Wow, that was wonderful. I had a friend who sang with the Gaither group and was on the Gaither Homecoming um, programs that you've probably seen on TV. And he passed away at a young age, and I had a chance to go and do a funeral for him, and it became a Gaither Homecoming thing. It was a 3-hour funeral service, the most uplifting thing I've ever been to in my life, and that sounded an awful lot like the way they were singing there. Boy, I am so impressed with your church and so grateful to Paul Moore for giving me the chance to come here today. I've had a chance to go back through some of the facility. It's beautiful. The sanctuary is beautiful. The decorations are beautiful. Your choir is big and talented, and your worship team is so good. You're very, very blessed to be here, and I'm blessed to be here this morning. I retired from full-time ministry back at the 1st of August, and one of the great joys of that is being able to go around to where some of my buddies preach and other churches that I've never had a chance to go to, and so I've been doing that. I don't have to worry about all the preparations and all of that kind of thing, and I'm appreciative to have a chance to come and see the place that I've heard about from Paul and the people that he holds so dear as your pastor. I have maybe two questions I want to ask you before I get started right now. One is, how many of you have ever worked at or eaten at Bo's Fish Camp? Anybody work there? I'm wondering if any of y'all used to have. And the second question is, what happened? I missed it. I used to live in Greenville before I moved to Beaufort, and I know many of you, people who live in Inman, I would assume, go over to Spartanburg, maybe even over to Greenville to go out to eat. But when I lived in Greenville, I drove to Inman. It was my favorite restaurant, Bo's Fish Camp. And when it closed down, I had to go to Beaufort in order to start getting good seafood. And so I moved down there back now, and glad to come and I'll share with you. I'm also very pleased to have some friends from Beaufort who, just like me, have relocated back up to the upstate, and I'm so thankful they've come to share with us today. That passage from Jeremiah is a really key passage in the Old Testament, particularly that last part when he gets to verse 31, and he starts talking how hopefully he's going to have a relationship with people that will be different than what the relationship was before. You know, when we were kids, we were taught that the most solemn of promises were promises of the heart. We do our thinking with our heads, but we do our acts of conviction with our hearts. Are you telling me the truth? Cross my heart. Do you really mean what you just said? Cross my heart. Not cross my brain, cross my head, cross my heart. This is where things are important. Even as a kid, I knew that when you spoke of the heart, you spoke of the sacred. I remember another practice from childhood, crossing one's fingers. If you cross your fingers, you can tell somebody something that's not true, and it's okay. You can promise to do something, but if you cross your fingers, you're exempt. You really didn't mean it when you said it. I never did really like that cross your fingers thing very much. I liked it better to be able just to trust people to do what they said they would do, but with this cross your fingers practice, you really had to watch people. I grew up in Laurens. My childhood was spent in Laurens, so it's not too far from here. My family came from the Watts Mill area of Laurens. And I was the youngest of 6 cousins, and I had cousins who took this practice of cross your fingers to a real art form. If you give me your $1, they said, I'll buy some firecrackers, and when you come over next week, you can shoot them with me. So I would come over the next weekend, and my $1 was gone, and the fireworks had all been shot. I said, you said I could shoot firecrackers with you. And they said, I had my fingers crossed. That was when I started using the cross your heart test. Promise, cross your heart. And those rascals tried to cross their fingers while they crossed their hearts. But I caught them. And we worked out a deal where nothing could undo a crossing your heart. Even as a kid, I knew there was something sacred about the heart. I know it's an oversimplification, but it seems to me that the whole story of the Old Testament is a story of people who crossed their fingers and not their hearts. They were always trying to find a way to get around the expectations. Actually, the story of the Old Testament is really the human story, because we can all find ourselves in it from the earliest pages. Do not eat from the fruit of this tree, or you will surely die. And then, with their fingers crossed behind them, they say, okay. What do? But they go and eat from the tree. That's our story. You shall have no other gods before me. And then they worship the culture around them, and worship the way the culture around them worships. This is our story too in many ways. You shall not bear false witness. They promise to do things that they never really have any intention of ever doing. And that's our story too sometimes. You shall not covet what belongs to your neighbor. And then they set up systems to exploit the poor. And they're driven by the desire of acquisition more and more. Too often that's still our story. One commentator writing on this passage in Jeremiah says, what became apparent to those who looked back over Israel's past was that the nation not only refused to obey the law, the old covenant, but in fact they were quite simply incapable of obeying it. It was the realization of this that produced one of the greatest crises for Israel's faith. How could Israel be God's holy people if by her very nature she was incapable of being holy? Jeremiah in chapter 13 expressed this problem aptly. Can the Nubian change his skin, or the leper his spots? And you, can you do good, you who are schooled in evil? It seems to me that so much of the Old Testament is about using good sense. That's what God was trying to get them to do. It's about the law. Here are the rules for living. If you follow these rules, life will be better for you and for everybody around you. But something about the way that we're made, this propensity to do what the Bible calls sin, leads us to wrong choices and wrong attitudes. And Israel's problem was that they were always trying to get around God, trying to get around His law, trying to espouse it on the one hand and figure out how to get around it on the other. Sometimes that's our problem as well. We like to get around things. Halloween's coming up pretty soon. And I remember one Halloween, a family had to go out for some social occasion, so they left a bowl of candy and a bowl of apples on the porch for any trick-or-treaters who might come by. But afraid that the first youngsters to come by might take more than their share of the candy, they left a sign by the bowl that said, "Please be considerate of others and just take one piece of candy. Remember, God is watching." Some wise guy made another sign that he put by the bowl of apples. It said, "Take as many apples as you want. God's watching the candy." A way to get around it. That's what people will do. As long as they see God as the local cop and the law is seen as some external set of rules to be bent or broken, so long as we don't get caught. Israel treated God like an authority figure, to be outwitted rather than a father to be loved, respected, and obeyed. Something had to change. It had gone on for generation after generation after generation. They never could get their act together. Something had to change about the way they looked at God. Something had to change in their hearts. So let me share a personal story. A teenage boy came home one night from a night of partying. It was really the first time he'd ever done any serious drinking. He wasn't really a bad boy. He was just somebody who wanted to be popular with his friends. And even in his impaired state, he knew the light still on in the living room meant trouble. Someone was up and waiting. The front door opened at about the same time that his foot hit the first brick of the steps leading into the foyer. And there she stood, the law embodied, the righteous judge. He tried to charm his way in, but she was hot on his trail. Wherever he went, she followed, until finally she cornered him in the kitchen. "You've been drinking," she said. "I have not," he lied. He had his fingers crossed. And in his drunken stupidity, he said, "See," and blew his breath, his telltale breath in her face. She slapped him. The only time she'd ever been physical with him in his life. In his younger days, his father had been the one to spank him when he did something wrong, but this night, she was the law, and the law slapped him. And he laughed, and she slapped him again. And there they stood in a battle of wills. She told him to go to his room, and he did so, gladly, mostly just glad to be free. He was embarrassed a little, but he wasn't afraid. He was too old. He was too big. He was too strong to be afraid anymore. He was mostly angry. Angry at getting caught. Angry at the ever-presence of the law. The next morning they talked. The disappointment still between them, but no longer the alcohol. She spoke differently toward him. She didn't sound like the law. She spoke of the problems that alcohol had caused in her family's life. She reminded him of the role that alcohol had played in his own father's life and death by suicide, and of the fears that she bore for him, her son, her only child. His mother was a strong woman, a woman who did not cry open or often. But that morning, her voice broke, and she dabbed away some tears, and she began to write her law on his suddenly tender heart. I cannot tell you that he never drank again, but the day would come when he didn't. The seeds of his abstinence were planted that quiet morning when the law became more personal. I can tell you he never came home like that again. And it wasn't because he was afraid of her. It was because he never, ever wanted to see that look of hurt and disappointment again on the face of the one that he loved and the one who loved him. You see, fear only goes so far. And common sense only goes so far. In these words of Jeremiah, I hear the whisperings of another way. I hear the plan of the Heavenly Father to appeal not to fear and not to sense, but to the heart. To me, this is the pivotal passage in the Old Testament. In this word from God, spoken by Jeremiah, we trace the beginning of the division of the Bible into two distinct sections. The Old Covenant, dominated by law and judgment, and the New Covenant, dominated by grace and forgiveness. Now, there is in God a capacity for judgment. It's true. Don't think that I'm saying that that's not. There is a righteousness in God that cannot simply overlook the sin that so characterizes our lives. That's the first message that Jeremiah was called to bring to his people. The first part of that verse and the things that came before it. The message that he did not want to speak. A message of judgment. A message that made him the most reluctant of prophets. But toward the end of his life, Jeremiah had a very different message. God is at the very core of his being, not a judge, not the law. Nearly 700 years later, on the other side of the cross, 700 years after Jeremiah spoke these words, on the other side of the cross, in words attributed to the disciple of Jesus named John, this thought crystallized in 3 words. God is love. That's who God is, at the very core of his existence. Now, I don't know exactly what Jeremiah envisioned when he spoke of this new covenant that would be written on the hearts of men and women. But I do know that this passage, this very passage, was on Jesus' mind when he gathered his disciples in the upper room the night before his conviction, before his crucifixion. This new covenant of which Jeremiah spoke so long ago is about to be signed. This is the new covenant, Jesus said, which is in my blood. This is the covenant which is to be written on your heart, not just in your mind. This is the covenant by which all shall know God personally. You used to hear about God. Somebody would tell you about God. He said that's not going to be the case anymore. Sometimes the people's teeth were set on edge because they were suffering for the sins of another generation. So that's not going to be the case anymore. Each person's going to have to deal with their own sin and seek their own forgiveness. It becomes personal now. This is the covenant by which God will forgive your iniquity and he will remember your sin no more. In Jesus, God has done for us what we cannot do for ourselves. If you believe, where? In your heart, that God raised Jesus from the dead, and if you confess with your lips that Jesus is your Lord, you will be saved. That's the deal. That's the deal. It's what he does for you, not what you do for him. It's when the law is written on your heart and the relationship becomes personal and real. It is as if we who spend so much of our lives crossing our fingers, trying to get around a God that we've been taught is overbearing, the law personified, out to catch us, out to get us whenever we slip up. It is as if we suddenly see God in a whole new light, the way that teenage boy saw his mother. A God of grace who loves us with a love that is beyond measure, that it is our hearts that he wants. He wants our love. He wants our relationship with him. And then everything else will follow. It seems too simple. It is as if we hear the promises of God and we wonder if they really can be true for someone like we are. Could God really love me enough to die for me? Could God really love me enough to go as far as we read about in the cross? In Jesus, crucified and bleeding, God has spoken definitively for all time. I love you. I cross my heart. In the Lord's Supper, Jesus said, remember this. Don't forget it. Next week, I will visit the site where tradition says the Last Supper took place. The room now actually traces back to the 12th century, built by the Crusaders over the ruins of another church that was built over the ruins of another church that was supposedly built over the place where John Mark lived and the upper room took place. And when I'm in that room, I will remember that God crossed his heart, and Jesus made a promise. I will lead a communion service outside the garden tomb where many believe Jesus was resurrected. We will do that day what we're doing here today, and I will remember the Christ who died for me, and the Christ that God raised from the dead, in order that we might have this personal relationship, and that I might not look with him with suspicion anymore, but rather with gratitude, that his law might be in my heart and not something external that I'm trying to live up to. And today I gather with you, thousands of miles and hundreds of years away from where all of it started. And I do, and you do, what Jesus told us to do. To remember him. And to remember how far God's love will go for you to belong completely to him and eternally to him. That's what we remember when we come to the Lord's Supper table today. God loves us. And in Jesus, he crossed his heart. And nothing can outdo a crossing the heart or undo it. We invite you to the table. Jeremiah is going to come and give us some instruction about how we're supposed to do that. And turn it over to you.